Good afternoon. My name's Phil Joyce. I'm Managing Director of the Orange Partnership. I have two daughters, 18 and 21. Here they are. That's Ellen on the left, Ruth on the right. I love them dearly. I'm very proud of them, like many doting dads out there in the audience, I'm sure. And they're fine now, but there was that interesting period, the sort of middle teenage years, between about, I would say, 14 and 17, something like that. When I say interesting, I'm being slightly euphemistic. Probably more appropriate word will be nightmarish. In many ways, during that period, they were like creatures from another planet. Their world was virtually impenetrable to me. This fascination with technology. You know, they'd sit for hours doing this with a smartphone, often to each other in the same room. Yeah, very bizarre. There was an overwhelming fascination with Kim Kardashian, which I could never see, such that they'd sit for a whole afternoon and watch a show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which I'd probably seen half a dozen times before. It was the one where Kim goes shopping. I think most of the Keeping Up with the Kardashians are the ones where Kim goes shopping. But most of all, the barrier was around language. I just didn't understand what they were talking about. And all of this created a barrier which I found very difficult to cross. Even now, my youngest, who's in the middle of her A-levels, told me, "Oh, Dad, you know, when I finish my exams, I'm going to ton up." I looked at her and I thought, I have no idea what you just said. You know, it was just totally over my head. Now, if you look to the right there, you get a tantalising glimpse of Ruth's boyfriend, Josh. Now, Josh takes this to a whole new level, I have to say. I like people who are concise. I think concise is good. But Josh has been able to boil down the English language, the language of Shakespeare, into a series of grunts and two words. And the words are, what, and tellingly, no. So it's quite impressive stuff. I think it's a different world. I don't know where they're going. I'll come back to this if I may. So why am I here? Well, I want to talk to you about commercial assurance. I want to talk to you about corporate governance, auditing and assurance around major projects. This is the theme, basically, for my presentation. I'm a chartered accountant. About 12 years ago, I created an approach to auditing and to assurance at the Terminal 5 programme, £4.2 billion programme, massive infrastructure works. It was a building, it was new rail infrastructure, car parks, you name it. And off the back of that, we created a business, the Orange Partnership. And for the last 10 years, we've basically been providing assurance and governance type services, audit services. I did a quick tally up, and over the last 10 years, we've probably been involved in contracts worth probably about £50 billion, major projects, construction projects, but also big R&M projects. And the majority of that's been about assurance work, by which I mean identifying issues, monitoring the resolution of those issues. We often get called in when things go wrong. So what I wanted to do basically was share my experience of where things can go wrong and how assurance and governance can perhaps help to stop those things going wrong in the first place. Before you think I'm going mad, I'll return to my daughters, Ellen and Ruth. This obsession with technology, this complex and difficult language, I think exists in the whole world of governance and assurance. There's the connection. It's something which can create an opaque world which is difficult to understand and get a hold of. I just put up on the slide there some of the sort of difficult, unpleasant sort of areas of governance. I'd like to read a little bit to you from ISAE 3000, which, as I'm sure you know, is the assurance engagements other than for audits or reviews of historical information, international audit standard, which is produced by the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board. It talks about attestation engagements, and assurance engagements in which a party other than the practitioner measures or evaluates the underlying subject matter against a criteria. A party other than the practitioner also often presents the resulting subject matter information on a report or statement. And it sort of expands on that for probably 120 pages. It's very opaque stuff, it's very dull, and I'm saying that as a chartered accountant who gets turned on by this sort of stuff. Even worse, I think, is where we get sort of made-up language around assurance and around audit. Because I think that's often a symptom of an overly complicated approach, which basically just adds costs without any real tangible added benefit. So my objective here is just to give you a simple explanation of how this whole thing works. So, a little bit about NEC. NEC usually avoids problems. I think it's a great form of contract because things do go wrong, but quite often, almost without fail, the parties come together in this spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. It actually means something. You know, it's very rarely that you sort of get the contracts kicked off without that kind of partnership approach in place. And when it works well, it works very well, particularly where things do go wrong, which can't be controlled. The parties coming together to sort those issues out is a real strength of this form of contract, rather than sort of heading back to their sort of positions to fight it out. But things can go wrong, and typically what, in my experience that is where you've got outturn costs starting to increase unexpectedly. So what was a £10 million contract all of a sudden becomes a £12 million contract without any sort of warning or kind of upfront notice that this could happen. That's quite often when we get called in. Phil, for goodness sake, go and find out what's going on. We would call that, again, trying to simplify the whole thing, an unpleasant commercial surprise. An unpleasant commercial surprise works both ways. So from an employer's point of view, if the contractor comes along and says, I'm sorry, this has gone up £2 million, I haven't told you about this today, but here's another £2 million on your bill, what that does is take away the employer's ability to manage the situation. They're not able to sort of try and mitigate. It's a fait accompli. Blimey, they may not even have the funding for that. They may need to go and talk to their boss, and their boss, in turn, loses his ability to manage and mitigate the situation. It's also an issue for contractors as well. I'll give you another unpleasant commercial surprise, which can be me, basically, sort of turning up to do some audits. So I come along 3 years into, or 2 years into a 3-year audit and say, here's a contract clause which you've been charging money against. I don't think that's appropriate. I think you owe the employer £1 million back. That's a horrible unpleasant surprise. What it means basically is the poor old contractor's got to go back to his boss and say, those margins I've been reporting, that bonus you paid me, what we put in the financial statements, may not actually be right. So things do go wrong, will always go wrong with projects, but I think many of these commercial surprises arise when they really don't need to. They can be seen off. And that's where I think commercial assurance can come in. So what sort of things can go wrong? There's something going through this whole thing which I think is complacency. It's the biggest risk in any contract. I'm talking here mainly, I would say, about sort of the open book side of NEC, so options C, D, E. So under those circumstances, you know, you've got the jobs being built, cash flows flowing, contractors being paid, everything looks fine. You're relying on the pain gain mechanism to actually drive the holding down of costs, but nobody's actually checking to make sure that what's going on the ground is actually what we expect, what we're seeing in the numbers. And I think complacency is a big issue with this. So checking is useful. Because what sort of things can go on? Well, top one here, different contractual interpretations. Really important to have a common understanding of what the contract means, what it's saying. I think different interpretations can lead to conflict. If I had a penny for every time I heard this statement, but that was never the intention. I go and talk to a contractor and say, well, look, you know, I don't think you should have charged this because the contract says that. And he'll say to me, or she'll say to me, well, that was never the intention. We're going to do something else. But it's in the contract. That's what you've signed. And that's my benchmark, if you like, as an auditor. And there's kind of, particularly, for example, the schedule of cost components around people, there are clauses there that can lead to conflict and uncertainty, although they prima facie look quite sort of clear. So, for example, things like pension costs. So if a contractor has a pension hole going back years, and an employer is asked to fund some of that pension hole through employers' pension contributions, that's going to increase the cost potentially quite significantly. Is that an appropriate cost? Well, it's not for me or anybody to say, but it's something where I think you need to have an understanding up front of what is appropriate. What you don't want to happen is for me to come along, say 2-3 years in the contract, say you charge that, and the employer to say, oh no, I don't think that's appropriate. Because then there's a sort of seeds of dispute, if you like. There are many more like that. Training is another one. Sure, you want to, the, excuse me, the schedule of cost component talks about safety training, but there are other elements of training, if you're using particular items of plant on the project, or if there's particular workspaces you need to be trained to work in. But what about sending people on MBAs and personal development type training? Is that appropriate? It's not as clear as perhaps at first sight it might be as it set out in the contract. Another big area in terms of different contractual interpretations is changes to the contract, which can often be very informal. So again, another thing that I often hear is, well, I know the contract says, but it was agreed we'd do this by so-and-so. And quite often you find that so-and-so has actually left the building, is no longer part of the project anymore. You've had sort of staff turnover, and memories differ. So what we thought maybe as an agreement some time ago may not actually exist in practice. One last point on this, I think a really important point, is the existence of subcontracts, because quite often I've seen work commence without subcontracts being in place, and that can cause all sorts of issues, particularly if the subcontractor goes bust. So common understanding and interpretation of contracts is a big reason why unpleasant commercial, or lack of common understanding, it's a big reason why these things can go belly up. One of the main reasons why things aren't spotting early are sort of weaknesses in reporting, so the reporting goes wrong. So I think under costs, under options C and E, for example, what typically happens is the contractor will produce an application for payment based on defined cost, all the transactions dumped from his accounting system into a format. Project manager assesses the amount due and then certifies an amount for payment. All very simple. But contracting organisations have been through incredibly tough times. As I'm sure a lot of you guys can testify to, their margins have been very, very tight, and in response to that, they've reduced overheads, including, I'm sad to say, accountants, which I always think is a bad idea. So what that means is accounting systems may not be robust. There may be missed costs, there may be failures to accrue, and all of a sudden we may get a catch-up that says, oh blimey, it's actually not costing us that, it's costing us that. Also another big issue is the use of spreadsheets. So in producing an application for payment, quite often see the transactions dumped into a spreadsheet and then, I'm trying to think of a better word than fiddled with, but messed around with all sorts of, sorry? Massage. But I don't want it to sound as if there's an intent with this, because often there isn't, but it's quite easy to make a mistake with a spreadsheet, and quite often this happens. And again, if the spreadsheet doesn't add up, it can lead to an unpleasant commercial surprise. Another big area here, is earned value. And I won't go into the detail on that, but for example, if you're using some kind of earned value approach on a project, you might be relying way down on the supply chain on some organisation which has got no experience in this area. And if it goes wrong, then there could be an understatement of cost, an overstatement of value. And I've seen that many times create a sort of shock, if you like. All of a sudden we've got the earned value on, blimey. We're actually £2 million away from where we should be. So weaknesses in reporting. Breakdowns in commercial processes. This is really useful. The compensation event fact mat 2014. What a great little piece of kit that is. This sort of sets out the process for agreeing compensation events: notify, decision, quote, assess. Great. It's really good if this happens, but on occasion it doesn't happen, and change is presented as kind of a fait accompli. So just going back to my original statement, it's around allowing people the opportunity to manage, to mitigate, to understand, to challenge. In some cases, I've seen change just presented like, no, it's going to cost this. We've got no choice but to. And the money's been spent. So again, breakdowns in what I've called commercial processes can create these unpleasant commercial surprises. Last one is fraud. is a difficult subject, this. Ignored by some employers, not dealt with well by all contractors. It's a difficult thing to sort of get around. And by its nature, it's hidden and covert, so finding this stuff, knowing it's there, is very, very troublesome. There's an Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which is a bunch of Americans. They're great, but they're the sort of world leaders in this whole area of fraud management. And they look at our world of construction, major projects, and they bring out the danger of fabrication of records and collusion as being a major issue, why big projects are hit for fraud. Never easy to prove one way or another, but it does have a massive potential to create an unpleasant commercial surprise. And even if it doesn't do that, if there's a whiff of fraud in the air, then it can create a loss of trust. Yeah, we're not sure, but you've damaged the trust between the two parties if fraud gets mentioned. Difficult area. Again, using commercial assurance, you can check to see the right measures are in place to manage these things. So, all of these things, hopefully, I've demonstrated, are preventable by spotting them early and dealing with them. And the way to do that is through some kind of audit called commercial assurance. So what is that? Well, it's a very simple definition of it. Someone who's independent, expert and objective, checking commercial management to see is it broken. And if it's broken, what needs to be done to fix it? Let me just pick that apart very quickly. Independent and objective. For assurance to be effective, it needs to be carried out, the checking needs to be carried out by someone who's got no relationship with any of the parties to the contract, who's not part of the project. Otherwise you end up with FIFA checking themselves, and we know how that ended up. Not great. So whoever's doing the checking, they must be free and be seen to free of any obstacle to tell it like it is. No, this is broken. We need to do something to fix it. Expert, by expert, I mean expert in the world of assurance and all that gubbins that I talked about earlier, ISA 3000. What is an appropriate level of evidence to gather as part of an audit, for example? If you don't have that kind of expertise, if there isn't that kind of background that sits behind the assurance work that's being carried out, then how do you know what work has been done to arrive at an opinion? And what that does is create two risks. So I've sent somebody off to do an audit. They haven't really done a very good job. They can come back with two things which are damaging. One is it's all fine, but they've missed something. And then you get the unpleasant commercial surprise pop up again in the future. The other, which is equally as bad, I think, is when they come up and say, okay guys, look, we've got a big issue here, we need to deal with this, when in actual fact they've got the facts wrong, or, quite often I see this when you've got an organisation coming in trying to prove its credentials by finding stuff. That's not really what assurance is about. It's about being objective. You do see organisations finding something and holding on to it, even though it may not be an issue. What that does is create significant uncertainty in the relationship. And the last two questions are the simple questions which assurance is all about. I've looked at this, is it broken? Yes. All right, what do I need to do to fix it? So that, to me, is a very simple solution to avoiding some of these avoidable commercial hiccups and issues. What does it mean? Well, in the long run, you can have confidence based on an independent and reliable view that things are okay. You don't have to worry. If you do have to worry, you can worry about those bits that need to be worried about. There are things which aren't working so well. You can identify and deal with problems early and therefore more cost effective. That's a really important one. If I go and do an audit a month into a contract and I find an issue where there have been £800 worth of charges, there's a problem about the interpretation of the contract, I can sort that out then and we just get on with it. If I then do the same audit 3 years in and find the same issue and £2 million have been charged against that, then all of a sudden it's a much more difficult issue to deal with for all the reasons I mentioned. You can also monitor the management of emerging risks. So what's changing in the contract and making sure that the infrastructure, the controls, the processes are actually responding to new and emerging risks. And also finally, it sort of demonstrates strong corporate governance to stakeholders. So, as an organisation, as a project, you've done everything you can by doing this kind of work to identify and deal with the problems. It's kind of a defence. That's me. One last thought, though, going back to my daughters. Please don't be haters, I urge you, because I think this presentation has been sick. So.